The sun dips toward the horizon, bleeding deep gold and crimson across the vast surface of the Sea of Galilee. Every ripple catches the dying light, turning the water into a shifting expanse of molten metal. The heat of the afternoon finally breaks. A cool breeze rises from the center of the lake, brushing against the shoreline and carrying the sharp, clean scent of damp earth and salt. The air grows heavy with the approach of twilight. Above the hills, the sky bruises into violet, swallowing the last of the intense glare. The birds that circled the water all day have vanished into the trees. The water itself seems to hold its breath, the waves slowing their frantic pace until they merely kiss the sand. There is no urgency here now. The world feels suspended in the amber light of the closing day. The shadows stretch long and thin across the beach, pulling the shoreline into a deepening gray. Everything is still. Everything is waiting. The transition is absolute, marking the end of one cycle and the quiet, inevitable approach of the night. Along the shoreline, the day of labor reaches its final hour. Boats slide into the shallows, their keels grinding against the wet sand with a dull, rhythmic thud. Fishermen step over the gunwales, their movements heavy and deliberate after a long day on the water. They reach into the dark, sodden mesh of the nets, pulling them free from the water and dragging them upward onto the beach. The nets catch on the shore, leaving trails of glistening water and trapped silt behind them. One by one, the men coil the ropes and secure the masts, their faces etched with the fatigue of the trade. The clamor of the afternoon, the shouts of trade, the creak of rigging, the splashing of oars slowly drains away. As the last net is piled, the sound of human exertion recedes into the background. The men walk toward the village, their footsteps crunching on the pebbles, leaving the beach to the darkening tide. The harbor grows quiet, the only remaining sound being the soft, rhythmic slap of water against the sides of the wooden hulls, rocking them gently in the deepening gloom. The beach is empty now, stripped of the earlier bustle. A fresh, cool breeze sweeps off the lake, cutting through the stagnant air of the day. It carries a potent scent of salt, wet silt, and the faint, earthy aroma of the hills beyond. Each gust catches the loose sand, swirling it in low, spiraling patterns across the beach. The water responds to the wind, its surface rippling into short, choppy waves that slap against the wooden hulls of the moored boats. The sound is sharp and rhythmic, echoing in the hollow spaces of the empty vessels. This wind does not just move. It cleanses the space, erasing the lingering tracks left by the day's labor. The air feels thinner, sharper, and colder against the skin. Above, the sky settles into a deep, bruised indigo, while the lake reflects the deepening darkness. In this solitude, every small sound is magnified. The creak of a rope against a mast, the rhythmic slapping of water, the low rustle of tall grass at the edge of the dunes. The environment has become a vessel of absolute quiet, preparing the way for the path ahead. The stillness of the beach is broken by a new, singular rhythm. It is not the chaotic noise of the day, but the steady, measured pace of a man walking with intent. Jesus appears at the edge of the path, his figure etched against the darkening horizon. He does not hurry. He does not stop. His stride is long and even, carrying him across the uneven ground with a quiet, grounded force. As he enters the clearing, the very air seems to settle around him. He moves past the empty boats, his presence transforming the abandoned shoreline into a place of focus. The rhythmic slap of the waves against the hulls persists, but now it serves as a backdrop to the deliberate sound of his steady approach. He looks toward the water, his gaze sweeping across the expanse. His shoulders set in a line of quiet resolve. Every movement is fluid, devoid of hesitation or fatigue. He occupies the space with a gravity that pulls the scattered energy of the evening into a single, defined path. He continues forward, tracing the curve of the lake, his silhouette moving with a quiet, unshakable purpose that commands the silence of the night. The rhythm of his walk remains constant, a steady cadence against the soft grit of the lakeshore. With every forward motion, his feet press deep into the damp, dark silt. The ground yields under his weight, forming a distinct impression that captures the shape of his stride. He moves with a deliberate, unhurried grace, each step pressing firmly into the earth. Behind him, the impressions form a temporary trail, a sequence of indentations marking his passage across the sand. A few feet away, the water of the lake laps at the margin of the beach. A small wave, pushed by the evening breeze, curls inward and slides over the sand. It reaches the nearest print, softening the edges, then washes over it entirely. The silt levels out, the water recedes, and the ground returns to a smooth, unbroken surface. The cycle repeats. He continues forward, undisturbed by the erasure behind him, his pace never wavering. He does not look back at the marks he leaves behind. He focuses solely on the path ahead, his feet finding purchase on the shifting landscape. The weight of his movement is real, yet it leaves no permanent scars upon the shore, as if the land itself recognizes the fleeting nature of his physical presence here. The shoreline beneath his feet changes character. It is no longer just sand and water, but a geography of memory. He pauses by a cluster of jagged rocks jutting into the surf, his hand brushing the rough surface. Here, the landscape begins to reveal its history. Every stretch of beach, every bend in the path, now carries the weight of a specific encounter. He looks at the vacant space where nets once lay tangled in piles, the air still thick with the residual image of work completed. The terrain acts as a silent witness to the years of effort. A narrow inlet nearby marks a point of transition, a boundary where the mundane labor of the day gave way to something far greater. He traces the horizon line with his eyes, seeing not the beauty of the dusk, but the markers of his own ministry. The ground he treads is etched with the invisible lines of his labor, a map drawn in sweat and silence. He stands still for a moment, the wind pulling at his hair, his gaze fixed on the quiet expanse that holds the echoes of his work. Every stone and tide pool is a coordinate in a larger design, mapping out the trajectory of his mission across this rugged terrain. He halts his stride at a wider expanse of the beach where the sand is matted with old, dried kelp. This is the spot. The air feels heavier here, charged with the phantom sound of heavy ropes hitting the wooden deck of a boat. He looks down at his feet, then shifts his gaze toward the water. In the fading light, the empty space seems to fill with the motion of men working. He sees Peter, hands calloused and raw, pulling at the mesh, his face turned toward the horizon with a look of restless searching. Beside him, Andrew pauses, a heavy coil of cordage gripped in his fingers. The air is thick with the scent of brine and the low, rhythmic grunts of labor. Jesus watches the phantom scene unfold, the way the brothers stood knee-deep in the surf, bound by the daily struggle of their trade. He remembers the exact slant of the sun against their backs before the world shifted. It was here, amidst the tangled threads and the relentless pull of the tide, that their lives ceased to be measured by the weight of their catch. He reaches out, his fingers brushing the cool, damp air where the memory holds firm, closing the gap between the men they were and the men they became. The echoes of the laboring men fade, replaced by a profound and sudden stillness. He stands at the water's edge, watching the tide retreat as if it were pulling the past back into the deep. It was here that he spoke the command that severed their attachment to the sea. He breathes in the cooling air, and the memory of that moment sharpens, cutting through the evening haze. The words, "Follow me," hang in the silence, heavy with the weight of an eternal pivot. They were not merely a suggestion, but a threshold. As he speaks them in his mind, he feels the ripple effect of that choice, the way the simple, rhythmic life of the fisherman ended, and the arduous road of the disciple began. He looks out at the dark horizon, seeing the path that opened up the moment those words touched their ears. The destiny of those two men was unmade and remade in the space of a single breath. He walks forward again, his pace measured, fully aware that the sound of those words still vibrates through the history of this shoreline, unchanging and absolute in their power to demand everything. A few paces further along the silt, the shoreline curves sharply toward a cluster of jagged rocks. This is the place. The tide here is calmer, the water barely whispering as it touches the sand. He stops, his gaze resting on a patch of ground where the light catches the wet pebbles. The memory returns with the clarity of a physical strike. He sees the boat, the wood weathered and grooved by years of salt, bobbing against the current. James and John are there, their hands locked onto the heavy oars, pulling against the resistance of the lake. Then, the shift. The moment their hands loosened, the oars did not just slip, they were intentionally released, clattering against the gunwales before sliding into the dark water. The sound of that impact remains etched in his awareness, a sharp, final note of departure. They did not hesitate. They did not look back at the nets or the haul they had spent the morning gathering. They simply stood, letting the momentum of their former life die in the wake of the boat. He stares at the ripple where the memory holds, acknowledging the total, absolute nature of that surrender. It was a complete departure from the life of coin and stone, a radical pivot into the unknown that he had invited them to embrace. The departure left an empty space on the shore, a void where their father Zebedee stood among the abandoned nets. They had walked away from the familiar structures of trade and inheritance without a second glance. This was the moment the old world fractured. He watches the water, seeing the reflection of the stars shift as the current pulls the surface into new shapes. Their decision was a deliberate rejection of stone, coin, and the temporary security of a life anchored to the earth. They were building something else now, a kingdom not measured by the weight of a harvest or the strength of a hull. He recognizes the cost of that transition, the way a son must unbind himself from the expectations of his kin to embrace a radical spiritual horizon. The air grows colder, yet the stillness holds a new, heavy significance. This was the foundation. They had stepped off the path of simple labor and onto a road that would never lead them back to the docks. He remains motionless, listening to the small, rhythmic pulse of the lake, understanding that every step they took from that moment forward was a brick laid in a kingdom that would outlast the very ground beneath his feet. The evening air carries a deceptive peace. The lake slows, the waves thin, and the day's exhaustion settles into the sand. But beneath this surface of calm, a different pulse beats. He feels the tightening of time, a pressure that the cooling breeze cannot touch. While the world around him finds rest, his mission demands a relentless forward momentum. The contrast is absolute. Every quiet moment here is a countdown, a brief hesitation before the path narrows toward the inevitable. He stands amidst the stillness, yet his mind moves with the weight of the coming trials. He measures the distance not in miles, but in the steps remaining before the world changes forever. The urgency is a physical presence now, pressing against his resolve. He knows the destination is fixed. He knows the cost is already written in the quiet spaces between heartbeats. The soft lapping of the water against the shore sounds less like a lullaby and more like the ticking of a clock that cannot be stopped. He breathes in the salt air, steadying himself against the internal gravity of a purpose that will soon demand everything he has to give. The peace of the shoreline is a thin veil, and he knows that beyond it, the road to Jerusalem waits, indifferent to the beauty of the dusk. He halts his stride at the very edge of the silt. The water here is dark, shifting into a deep, obsidian hue as the last light abandons the surface. He leans forward, palms resting on his knees, watching the ripples dissipate into the black. This lake is not merely water to him. It is a repository of every command he has ever issued to the elements. He traces the patterns on the surface, seeing the ghost of his own influence in the way the current resists his gaze. The lake remembers the stillness he imposed upon the gale. It remembers the resistance he conquered with a single word. He stands as a solitary figure against the vast, darkling expanse, the only point of certainty in a landscape that has bowed to his will. The water rises and falls with a rhythmic, heavy persistence, acting as a mute witness to the power he wields over the natural world. He watches the shadows deepen, observing how the lake holds the memory of the supernatural in its depths. The silence is profound. He does not move, allowing the cold spray to brush his face, anchoring his resolve in the presence of the water that has seen him defy the limits of the earth and sky. The memory of the gale rises, sharper than the cool evening breeze. It was not a quiet time. The sky had turned the color of bruised iron, and the lake, usually a mirror, had transformed into a churning, hungry beast. He recalls the sound of the wind, a high, piercing scream that tore through the rigging of the small boat. Water surged over the gunwales, heavy and freezing, threatening to drag the vessel into the abyss. His disciples had been frantic, their hands slipping on wet ropes, their eyes wide with the certainty of drowning. Every wave was a wall of black water closing in. He stood amidst the chaos, the only thing in the storm that did not sway. He spoke, and the air itself seemed to recoil. The wind did not just die, it vanished. The waves, mid-crest, collapsed into flat, glassy stillness. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the ragged breathing of men who had stared into the void. He remembers the sudden shift from the roar of destruction to the stillness of a grave. The water today remains a witness to that absolute authority, a reminder that the elements are merely instruments, and he is the one who holds the final word over the storm. The memory of the storm does not fade. It deepens into something more profound. He recalls the night the waves were not just a threat, but a path. The water, usually a fluid boundary, yielded to his presence. He stepped off the side of the boat, and the surface did not break. It held. He remembers the sensation of the liquid shifting under his weight, then hardening, a firm foundation where there should have been only depth and dissolution. Each step was a deliberate act of defiance against the laws of nature. The water pressed upward against his soles, dense and supportive, a mirror reflecting the stars that watched in silence. He walked across the crests, his pace steady, untroubled by the rolling abyss beneath him. He was the master of the elements, turning the chaotic expanse into a road. The memory brings the smell of ozone and the chill of the spray back to his mind, but the fear that had gripped the disciples is absent. He sees only the distance he traversed, the impossible span covered by a single steady stride. It was a bridge built not of wood, but of will and divine command, proving that the deepest waters are no barrier to his reach. The memory narrows to a single point on the dark expanse. Peter. He had stepped out with eyes fixed, but the roar of the wind returned to his ears. The moment his focus broke, the water turned back into an enemy. He began to sink, his legs vanishing into the black, churning depths. He thrashed, his hands clawing at the spray, his lungs pulling in water instead of air. He cried out, a jagged sound that cut through the gale. There was no hesitation. He moved forward, covering the distance in an instant. He reached out and caught Peter's wrist before the waves could pull him under. The grip was firm, locking onto skin that was cold and trembling. He pulled. Peter rose from the depths, dripping and gasping, his weight suddenly heavy as reality returned. They stood together on the surface, the water supporting them both as if it were solid stone. He looked into those wide, terrified eyes and saw the flicker of doubt extinguished. The storm continued to howl around them, but in the circle of their contact, the chaos ceased to matter. He held him steady until the fear bled away, replaced by the realization that as long as he was held, the abyss could not claim him. The memory of the storm recedes, replaced by the rhythmic slap of water against the shoreline. He stands at the edge of the Galilee, watching the light catch the surface. Each ripple that rolls toward the sand is a testament to the order he restored that night. The lake moves with a cadence he once commanded to silence. The water does not just lap at the shore, it carries the weight of a history he authored. Yet, his gaze does not remain on the water. It shifts to the villages that cling to the hillsides. He watches the shadows lengthen across the paths where he has walked for months. He sees the heavy gait of the laborers returning home, the way they lean into the climb, their bodies bent under the exhaustion of the day. He notes the stillness of the houses where the sick lie, waiting for a reprieve that his presence alone can offer. The power that stilled the gale is the same power that aches at the sight of this persistent human burden. He stands motionless, observing the struggle of those who have no strength left to give. He watches the world continue its slow, grinding rotation, his resolve hardening with every breath. He is here not to watch the tide, but to carry the weight of those who are sinking. He walks, but his mind drifts to the thresholds of the houses he visited. He sees the woman who reached out through a crowd, her fingers trembling as they touched the edge of his garment. He remembers the immediate cessation of her fever, the color returning to her drained cheeks. He sees the man by the pool, limbs withered from years of disuse, who stood upright the moment he heard the command to rise. He recalls the sound of joints cracking into place and the sudden, sharp intake of breath as lungs cleared. These were not mere stories. They were physical realities etched into his memory. He sees the weary families huddled around hearths, the children with sunken eyes who grew vibrant after his hands rested on their foreheads. He remembers the weight of their burdens, the physical toll of disease, the tremors of the afflicted, and the silence of those who had lost the ability to speak. He traces the path of his own history through the relief that followed his touch. Each person he healed had been a ripple of life returning to a stagnant pool. He knows the texture of their calloused hands and the way their eyes widened when the pain finally retreated. He carries these images as he continues his walk, his stride steady, his purpose fixed on the next hand that needs to be held. The sun dips toward the jagged line of the hills, bleeding a final, bruised gold across the surface of the Galilee. As the last sliver of light vanishes behind the crests, the warmth leaves the air instantly. A damp, biting chill rises from the lake, turning the reeds along the bank into sharp, dark silhouettes. The wind picks up, whistling through the gaps in the stone walls of nearby huts. The rhythmic slap of water against the hulls becomes erratic, louder, more insistent. Darkness does not fall gradually. It rushes in, swallowing the path ahead and forcing his feet to find the uneven ground by memory alone. The transition is absolute. Where the horizon was once vibrant, it is now a void. The air tastes of metallic salt, sharp enough to sting the throat. He stops. The sudden absence of the sun acts as a physical weight, pressing down on his shoulders. The environment shifts from a place of labor to a place of waiting. He looks into the deepening gloom, and the clarity of his vision narrows. The atmosphere has turned brittle, cold, and expectant. He draws his breath, the air whistling through his nostrils, and stands still as the last vestige of the day dies completely, leaving only the shadow of the coming night. The shoreline remains, but it loses its definition in the dark. He stares at the water, yet his eyes track something else. A shape begins to form in the distance of his mind, not of the landscape, but of wood. It is rough-hewn, jagged, and heavy. It rises from the darkness, a vertical beam intersecting a horizontal one, casting a long, sharp shadow across the sand at his feet. The image is static, immovable, and distinct. He blinks, but the silhouette does not fade. It stands against the backdrop of the night, stark and unyielding. The gentle lapping of the waves against the shore now sounds like the rhythm of a hammer hitting iron. He watches the phantom structure loom, its presence dwarfing the surrounding hills and the quiet lake. The air around him seems to thicken, cooling further as the mental shadow stretches across the path he must walk. He takes a step, and the ground beneath his feet feels solid, yet the weight of the vision pulls at his resolve. The cross remains fixed in his internal view, a dark marker on the horizon of his purpose. He grips his hands, feeling the tension in his palms, and continues forward, moving directly into the path where the shadow falls. The path no longer follows the curve of the water. It turns inland, rising steadily toward the hills, pointing toward the dust of the road that leads to Jerusalem. He walks with a measured, heavy cadence, each step digging into the dry earth. The air here is stagnant, lacking the salt breeze of the lake. He navigates the incline, his eyes fixed on the darkness ahead where the city walls wait. There is no turning back. The geography of his life has narrowed to this single, rutted track. He feels the inevitable pull of the city, a place of stone and iron, where betrayal is already waiting in the shadows of the gates. He does not stop to look back at the water. The sacrifice is no longer a distant thought, it is the terrain he is crossing. His breath is shallow and rhythmic, synchronized with the crunch of gravel under his feet. He knows what lies at the end of this climb. The wood, the nails, and the silence of the final hour. He continues to climb, moving deeper into the night, carrying the weight of the world toward the place where the road must end. The vision of the path dissolves, replaced by the sheer, unyielding reality of the wood. It is no longer a silhouette on the horizon. It is here, pressing against his consciousness with the weight of splintered timber and cold iron. He feels the rough grain of the beam against his shoulder, a phantom pressure that forces his back to bow. The air is suddenly sharp with the scent of dry cedar and stale dust. He stops. His hands twitch, fingers curling as if gripping something hard and immovable. The sound of a heavy hammer striking iron echoes in the stillness, sharp and rhythmic, vibrating through the ground beneath his feet. He shudders, his breath catching in his throat as the reality of the wood bites into his skin, a jagged, physical intrusion that demands his full attention. He stands rooted to the earth, the sensation of the nails piercing his hands and feet manifesting with agonizing clarity. The world around him blurs, the night sky retreating, leaving only the crushing, singular focus of the beam. He gasps, his chest heaving under the weight of the coming suffering, his body reacting to the phantom burden as if the wood were truly there, pinning him to the dark, silent earth. The phantom weight of the timber lifts, leaving his muscles trembling from the strain. He exhales, a long, controlled release of breath that clears the air. He stands upright, rotating his shoulders to shed the lingering pressure. The image of the nails and the wood recedes, replaced by the cold, damp reality of the night air. He wipes the sweat from his brow with the back of his hand and grips his staff firmly. His knuckles turn white as he anchors his grip. The hesitation is gone. He sets one foot forward, then the other, his gait regaining its rhythmic, purposeful cadence. He does not glance back at the place where the vision struck him. He looks ahead, eyes locked on the dark path, his posture rigid and unyielding. Every step is a deliberate choice. He is moving toward the inevitable, and he is moving with a speed that signals no desire to delay. The terrain is uneven, littered with loose stones and dry brush, but he does not stumble. His stride is long, steady, and driven by a singular, internal gravity. The path ahead is steep, yet he climbs without faltering, his focus absolute, his resolve forged into a movement that nothing can divert. A few paces behind, the disciples cluster together, their voices rising and falling in the cooling air. They do not see the path he walks. They see a throne waiting to be claimed. One of them gestures toward the silhouette of a distant town, his hands slicing through the dark with sharp, eager movements. They speak of crowns, of gold, and of the status they believe is their due. The sound of their chatter, though hushed, carries a jarring, rhythmic dissonance against the silence of the landscape. They kick up dust as they pace, their steps uneven and hurried, fueled by visions of a kingdom built on stone and coin. Jesus hears the words clearly, the names of seats of honor, the pride of their imagined future. He does not turn to correct them. He keeps his gaze fixed on the horizon, his own shoulders squared against the weight of the reality they cannot comprehend. The irony of their ambition presses against him, a heavy, intangible force that stands in stark opposition to the sacrifice he carries. He quickens his stride slightly, pulling away from the noise, his boots striking the earth with a steady, hollow thud. The disciples follow, oblivious, still weaving their elaborate dreams of power while the very air around them carries the quiet, impending truth of the cross. The debate behind him grows more animated. A disciple stumbles over a root, his sudden burst of laughter cutting through the night, followed by the others joining in, their voices light and carefree. They are still debating who among them will stand closest to the throne, their hands tracing shapes in the air as if they could already feel the weight of gold. They do not notice the way Jesus slows his breathing to manage the mounting pressure in his chest. They do not see the way his jaw tightens, or how his eyes remain fixed on the dark horizon where the path ends. He is physically just feet away, yet he exists in a different reality. One of them reaches out to tap a companion on the shoulder, punctuating a point about authority with a firm, confident strike. The sound of their footsteps is erratic, lacking the steady, rhythmic discipline of his own. They walk with the confidence of men who believe they have secured their future. Jesus keeps his arms folded across his torso, a small, involuntary movement that guards the secret of the cross. Every word they speak about crowns and earthly glory lands like a stone, sinking into the silence of the night. He does not stop. He does not explain. He simply maintains his pace, carrying the weight of the coming sacrifice alone, while the air around them remains filled with the hollow echoes of their ambition. The distance between him and the voices behind grew. He did not look back. His stride lengthened, turning from a walk into a deliberate, rhythmic cadence that demanded total focus. The path ahead narrowed, winding through a cluster of jagged rocks that forced him to adjust his footing. He stepped over the sharp stones, his weight landing with precision, never wavering or breaking rhythm. Every step was a conscious choice. He felt the cold draft of the night air, but it did not slow him. He kept his head tilted slightly forward, his gaze locked onto the dark trail that eventually turned toward Jerusalem. There was no hesitation in his gait, no detour taken to avoid the steep incline. He navigated the uneven ground as if he were walking on flat, paved stone, his body language radiating a singular, quiet intensity. He was not merely traveling. He was completing a trajectory he had set for himself long before this night. The muscles in his legs burned with the steady exertion, but his pace remained constant, rhythmic, and entirely purposeful. He reached the end of the rocky stretch and emerged onto a clearing, his silhouette dark against the dimming horizon. He continued, moving deeper into the night, fully embracing the weight of the road ahead, his stride firm and unbroken. The heavy air of the valley began to thin. Above, the first pinpricks of light broke through the darkening veil, small and sharp against the deepening blue. Jesus stopped. He tilted his head back, watching as the stars bloomed across the vast expanse, one by one, until the sky hung like velvet stretched tight over the world. There was no sound now, only the faint, distant pulse of the lake against the stones. He stood perfectly still, his frame motionless, letting the cold clarity of the night settle over him. The light from above was ancient, steady and unyielding, mirroring the quiet permanence of his own intent. He did not move for a long moment, simply breathing in the stillness, his eyes reflecting the shimmering dome of the heavens. It was a brief pause in the long march, a moment where the weight of the coming sacrifice seemed to align with the infinite reach of the stars. He shifted his weight, felt the cool ground beneath his feet, and looked out toward the horizon where the darkness was absolute. The stars did not flicker or fade. They remained constant, a silent witness to the journey he had undertaken. He turned his gaze forward again, his silhouette sharp against the sprawling canopy of light, and resumed his steady, measured movement into the deepening night. The lake surface caught the celestial glow, turning the dark water into a mirror of the heavens. Countless points of light danced on the ripples, shifting with the gentle movement of the tide. This was the same sky that had arched over the early, labor-worn hands of those who first cast their nets here. He watched the light fracture and reform across the surface, a cycle that had repeated for ages. The starlight did not just sit upon the water, it penetrated the depths, illuminating the path where nets had once been drawn. He saw in those shifting reflections the long line of faces, the generations of men who had stared into this same darkness, searching for a sign. The connection was tangible, a bridge woven from the same ancient fire that burned in the silence of the void. His path was not isolated. It was the culmination of every hope cast into these waters long before he arrived. The rhythm of the waves hitting the shore remained constant, a steady pulse linking the past to the unfolding future. He walked near the water's edge, his presence barely disturbing the stillness, while the light from above continued to bridge the distance between the shores he walked and the eternity he carried within. The legacy of the net and the oar merged with the quiet light, binding the history of the weary to the promise of the dawn. The shoreline ended, yet the momentum of his journey continued. He moved past the familiar docks and the silt-heavy banks where his work began. The geography of Galilee was fixed, defined by stones and reeds, but the mission he carried refused to stay within these borders. He stepped onto firmer ground, leaving the water behind. This was not merely a transition of place, it was a movement into a larger, unseen reality. His purpose was to anchor the lives of all men in a hope that existed outside the ticking of the clock or the rise and fall of the tides. He looked toward the vast, dark expanse ahead, seeing beyond the physical horizon to the generations yet to walk this earth. The labor he performed here was a seed planted in the soil of time, intended to grow into a shelter for every soul. He moved with a steady, deliberate gait, his presence acting as a bridge between the temporary nature of the world and the permanence of the truth he spoke. Every footfall was a claim on the future. He walked not to remain in the comfort of the familiar, but to ensure that the light he brought would outlive the night. Transcending the shores that had witnessed his first steps, the lake grew restless as the temperature dropped. Small, sharp waves began to slap against the damp sand, a rhythmic percussion that echoed the heartbeat of the shore. Each pulse of water brought a layer of foam up the beach before retreating into the dark expanse, pulling loose sediment back into the deep. The sound was constant, a steady metronome that filled the silence left by the departing day. He walked parallel to this rhythm, his own pace matching the cadence of the receding tide. The water lapped at the very edge of his path, wetting the stones and cooling the air. He did not look back at the empty docks or the shadows of the boats. His movement was forward, purposeful, and unhurried. The rhythmic wash of the waves provided a grounding weight, a physical anchor for the transition into the night. As he climbed the slight incline away from the waterline, the sound of the lake began to soften, fading into a low, steady murmur. He moved into the deeper gloom, his silhouette merging with the darkness, yet his stride remained firm. Every step he took was a continuation of the rhythm that had defined the shore, carrying the quiet resolution of his purpose further into the night. The distance from the water grew, yet the resonance of his calling only deepened. He climbed the final ridge, leaving the low-lying basin of the lake behind. Below, the water mirrored the stars, a vast expanse that had witnessed the start of his labor. But his focus now shifted toward the horizon of the future. This ministry was never bound by the geography of these shores. It was a persistent, silent wave traveling outward, crossing the boundaries of centuries. He walked into the gathering dark, yet his presence seemed to push the shadows back. The invitation he extended was not a temporary request, but a permanent threshold. He signaled for every soul to step away from the old, discarded life, and move into a radiance that no shadow could ever touch. The path ahead was long and demanding, leading toward a sacrifice that would cement this promise forever. He stopped for a brief moment, his back to the lake, and surveyed the path that lay before him. There was no hesitation in his stance. He turned and continued his ascent, a solitary figure carrying an inextinguishable fire that would burn long after the night had ended, reaching out to every generation that would ever seek the light.